You're watching the legal breakdown. So obviously we have some monumental news here. Donald Trump was disqualified from the ballot in Colorado. So the question now goes to the US Supreme Court. Glenn, is there any likelihood that the US Supreme Court doesn't take this issue up?
No, 100% they're going to take it up. I think the open question is, what are they going to do with it? If they stick with the plain language of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, Section 3, if you engage in insurrection after having taken an oath to support the Constitution, you can't hold office again. So I think the Colorado Supreme Court got it right. And, who knows what this Supreme Court will do. But if they just stick with the text of the Constitution, as the justices on the right are forever saying they're strict constructionists, hopefully they will get this one right. The Colorado Supreme Court decision will hold. Donald Trump will be banned not only from the ballot in Colorado, but if the Supreme Court affirms the Colorado ruling, he will be banned in all 50 states.
Just so that we know the stakes here, what does happen if the Supreme Court opts not to hear this case?
So if they opt not to hear the case, then the Colorado Supreme Court decision stands unchallenged. That means Donald Trump will not be on the ballot in Colorado. And here's the really interesting question, Brian. If you are a Secretary of State in the other 49 states, and you know that both a Colorado trial court and the Colorado State Supreme Court has found as a matter of fact and law that Donald Trump he engaged in insurrection and he is disqualified from having his name placed on a presidential ballot. Do you just go ahead and cavalierly put Donald Trump's name on your state ballot? I think things are going to get really interesting. I think it's an academic discussion because I can't see the Supreme Court not taking up this issue.
Right. I mean, to your point, wouldn't that just create a patchwork of different rules that would kind of be untenable for a general election?
It absolutely would. And, there is a similar concern when two Federal Circuit Court of Appeals decide a constitutional issue differently. The Supreme Court will almost always accept review of those cases because, the federal law and the Constitution can only mean one thing in all of the federal circuits. I think the same holds true for all of the states. Either an insurrectionist like Donald Trump is barred from being president or he's not.
Glenn, how will this process play out if the Supreme Court does hear this case? Are there arguments by both sides, or do they just make their decision based off of the facts that are already presented to the lower courts?
Yeah, good question. It's a little bit of both. So let me just do a deep dive into the criminal law for a minute. So there are different implications for factual findings by the trial court and legal conclusions by the trial court. So factual findings by the trial court, when I say factual findings, after a trial in Colorado at which lots of witnesses testified, the judge made a factual finding that Donald Trump engaged in an insurrection. Ordinarily, when a case works its way up through the appellate system, factual findings of the trial court are entitled to great deference. Why? Because a trial court judge is the only one who had eyes on the witnesses and could make the all-important credibility determinations. So here is the sort of legal mumbo jumbo. If there is a factual finding made by a trial court, it's entitled to great deference, and it will only be disturbed on appeal if there is no record evidence supporting it. Basically, the trial court judge would have had to have just been completely out to lunch. You now have factual findings that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. Those were accepted by the Colorado Supreme Court. So by and large, given the way the appellate system works, the Supreme Court is going to be stuck with those factual findings. Doesn't mean they can't go to the law and say, okay, even if he engaged in insurrection, the law doesn't necessarily support that he should be disqualified, which would basically make us a banana republic. But, the Supreme Court has done some pretty outrageous things in recent years.
Glenn, is there any argument in Trump's favor here in terms of why the U.S. Supreme Court might reverse the Colorado Supreme Court's ruling?
not a legitimate argument. The only argument that could be made is there, is some curious language in the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. They don't spell out, right? The section doesn't spell out that a president is disqualified if he engaged in insurrection. They don't use those words explicitly, but everything that's in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment basically leads one to that conclusion. It's just, the language that they use is a little bit imprecise, maybe even incomplete. But if you flip it on its head, I mean, is there really any viable argument that the President of the United States should be allowed to attack the United States, should be allowed to engage in insurrection, engage in rebellion, try to overthrow the United States of America, the government, the laws of the United States, and he should get another shot at being president, but every other office holder should not get a shot at ever holding office again? Again, that would take us one giant step in the direction of a banana republic.
And we've spoken about this before, but I think it's worth reiterating here. Can you outline the argument as to why the Supreme Court, even despite its political makeup, would be threatened by ruling in Trump's favor here?
Well, look, if they are going to rule that a president can attack the United States, can try to, in a very real sense, bring an end to American democracy, if they were to rule that that's good to go by them and by the Constitution, well, then Donald Trump maybe regains the reins of power, finishes the job. He is now a dictator. Let's call it what it is. And if there's one thing that a dictator has absolutely no interest in, it's a Supreme Court. So he would promptly, completely cut the legs out from under the Supreme Court. Heck, he might just try to disband the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court has given him a green light as somebody who engaged in insurrection, tried to overthrow the government, who is again in charge of the very government he tried to overthrow.
Right. For as conservative as this court is, I think the last thing it's looking to do is to contract its power to another branch of government, thereby rendering all of its power kind of useless, right? Glenn, let's finish off with this. What do you expect the timeline will be in terms of a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court here?
I've been heartened in recent weeks and months because the courts have been responding. They've been sort of meeting the urgency of the moment. They've been setting all these really, really expedited deadlines in the Trump litigation. I think the same will hold true here in Colorado. I think the Secretary of State has to make a final decision about whose name goes on the presidential ballot by January 5th. So I think this will be taken up by the Supreme Court promptly, and I think you're going to see a really prompt decision probably in early January.
And of course, as soon as we have any decision, we'll make sure to cover it here. So if you're not yet subscribed, please make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.